Everyone knows the best fighter Japan built in World War II. They know its name, its silhouette, its legend. They are almost all wrong. By 1944, Japanese engineers had already solved the problem that killed thousands of their own pilots: the missing armor, the fuel tanks that turned into fireballs at the first hit. They built a fighter that could outturn a Mustang, outclimb a Hellcat, and bring its pilot home instead of leaving him burning in the Pacific. It was faster than the aircraft that made Japan famous. It was tougher. It was, by almost every measure that matters in a dogfight, better. And it arrived exactly when there was nothing left to save. How does a country build its finest fighter of the entire war and still lose the sky? The answer starts on a factory floor in 1942 with an engineer trying to fix another man's mistake. His aircraft was called the Ki-84 Hayate. The world remembers it, if it remembers it at all, by its Allied nickname, Frank. By early 1942, the war in the Pacific had already taught Japan a brutal lesson, written in the wreckage of its own aircraft. The Mitsubishi Zero had been the terror of the skies for barely a year, and already American pilots were learning its secret. It could turn on a dime and climb like nothing else in the sky, but it broke like glass. No armor plate behind the pilot's seat. No self-sealing fuel tanks. A single burst of machine gun fire that would have merely wounded an American aircraft turned a Zero into a fireball, and its pilot with it. Japan had built a weapon that could win a dogfight and still kill the man flying it. At Nakajima Aircraft Company, an engineer named Yasushi Koyama was reading the same combat reports everyone else was reading, but he was reading them differently. The Imperial Army Air Service needed a successor to its aging Ki-84 Hayabusa, a fighter that shared the Zero's virtues and, more quietly, the Zero's fatal flaw. Koyama's assignment was simple to state and brutal to execute. Build something faster, something harder hitting, something that could still turn and climb with the best fighters in the Pacific, but this time, build something that would let its pilot survive being hit. That single decision would become the philosophy stamped into every rivet of the aircraft that followed. Where the Zero's designers had chased performance by stripping away anything that added weight, Koyama's team went the other direction. They wrapped the cockpit in 65 millimeters of armored glass. They bolted 13 millimeters of steel plate behind the pilot's head and shoulders. They sealed the fuel tanks so a bullet hole would close itself instead of igniting. For the first time in a Japanese fighter program, survival was not an afterthought bolted on at the end of the design process. It was the starting point. It was, in its way, a quiet act of rebellion against everything Japanese fighter doctrine had assumed was true, that speed and agility were worth any price, even the pilot's life. Koyama was betting that a heavier, better protected aircraft could still outfly anything America could put in the air if the engine underneath it was powerful enough to carry the extra weight without giving up an inch of performance. He was about to find out whether that bet would work, and whether the men flying it would ever get the chance to see it proven. Nakajima's answer to the Army's demand took shape on the drafting boards through 1942, and by March of 1943, it rolled out onto the runway at Ojima Airfield as a finished prototype, ready to prove that armor and speed were not, in fact, opposites. Underneath its cowling sat the engine that made the whole gamble possible, the Nakajima Ha-45 Homare, an 18-cylinder radial pushing out nearly 2,000 horsepower, more power than any engine yet fitted to a Japanese Army fighter. It was that engine, and only that engine, that let Koyama's team add hundreds of pounds of armor plate and self-sealing tankage without sacrificing the one thing Japanese fighter pilots refused to give up: the ability to outturn and outclimb whatever the enemy sent against them. The specifications the Army had set were unforgiving. The new fighter needed a top speed north of 380 miles per hour, a service ceiling above 30,000 feet, and firepower heavy enough to bring down American bombers as easily as fighters. On paper, it was a demand that pulled in three directions at once. Speed wanted a light airframe, firepower wanted heavy cannon and ammunition, and survivability wanted armor plate that added weight to both. Most engineers would have been forced to sacrifice one of the three. Koyama's team delivered all of them. When the numbers came back from testing, the aircraft topped out at 392 miles per hour, armed with two 20mm cannon in the wings and two 12.7mm machine guns in the nose, a punch heavy enough to shred a B-29's airframe in a single pass. But specifications on a test range meant nothing until the aircraft could prove itself against what it would actually face in the sky, and by 1943, that meant one aircraft above all others, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was already the dominant American naval fighter in the Pacific, a rugged, brutally simple design built around the same principle Koyama had just adopted: protect the pilot, armor the aircraft, and let raw horsepower make up the difference. Where the Zero had gone to war against thinly armored, underpowered early American fighters and won easily, Japan's new fighter would have to go to war against an opponent that had already learned the lesson of survivability years earlier and built an entire aircraft around it. The Hellcat was not a fighter that Japan could out-engineer through cleverness alone anymore. It would have to be outflown. Through late 1943, a service trials unit at Nakajima put the first 24 pre-production aircraft through their paces, refining the design under military scrutiny before the Army would commit to full-scale production. The results were unambiguous. In climb rate and turning radius, the new fighter matched or beat the Hellcat outright. In level speed, it was faster. And unlike the Zero, when a Hellcat's machine guns finally did connect, the pilot inside had a real chance of flying home. For the first time since the war began, Japan had built a fighter that could meet the best American design in the Pacific on equal terms, sometimes better than equal. The Imperial Army Air Service approved it for production and gave it a name that captured exactly what its designers had been chasing: Hayate, meaning gale, sudden, violent, and impossible to ignore. It entered frontline service in June of 1944, more than 2 years after Koyama had first sat down with those grim combat reports from the Zero's early battles. For a brief moment on the airfields of 1944, it looked as though Japan had finally built the fighter that could turn the tide back in its favor, an aircraft that could match the Hellcat maneuver for maneuver and, unlike its predecessor, bring its pilot home to fly again the next day. It had taken 2 years to solve the problem the Zero never could. What no one on that airfield in June of 1944 could yet see was that 2 years was exactly the margin Japan no longer had to spare. The first Hayates reached frontline units in the summer of 1944, and their earliest combat test came not over the home islands but far to the west, in the skies over China, where Japan still held airfields and needed fighters that could contest American bombers flying from bases the Allies had established deep in the interior. It was here, away from the scrutiny of the Pacific's main battles, that Japanese pilots got their first real measure of what Koyama's design could do. Reports filtering back to Nakajima and to Army Command were, for the first time in years, genuinely optimistic. Pilots who had spent the war flying the aging Ki-84, an aircraft that demanded they avoid being hit at any cost because a single burst of gunfire could turn it into a coffin, found themselves in a machine that let them fight differently. They could absorb a hit and keep flying. They could dive into a fight instead of avoiding one. But China was a preview. The real proving ground came that October when American forces launched their invasion of the Philippines at Leyte Gulf, and Japan threw everything it had left into defending the islands, including its newest fighter. Over Leyte and the airfields of Luzon, the Hayate met the aircraft it had been built to fight. American Hellcats flying off the carriers offshore, and Army Air Force P-38s and P-47s flying in from captured airstrips. For pilots experienced enough to exploit it and ground crews skilled enough to keep its temperamental new engine running at full power, the results validated everything Koyama's team had promised 2 years earlier. American pilots who tangled with a well-flown Hayate came home with a different opinion of Japanese engineering than the one they had carried into the fight. This was not the fragile, disposable Zero their fathers and older brothers had learned to beat by 1943. This was an aircraft that turned as tightly as anything Japan had ever put in the air, climbed faster than a Hellcat could follow, and, critically, let its pilot survive a hit that would have ended the fight for a Zero pilot instantly. American intelligence took the new fighter seriously enough to give it a code name, Frank, and seriously enough to want one intact. When examples were later captured and shipped back for evaluation, first by forward intelligence units in the Philippines, then flown in full test programs at American airfields, the verdict from the men who flew it against their own frontline fighters was consistent and, for the Japanese engineers who would never hear it, vindicating. The Hayate outclimbed and outturned the P-51 Mustang, the aircraft American pilots trusted most to win a dogfight in Europe or the Pacific. It matched the Hellcat's raw performance while carrying heavier armor and a harder-hitting cannon armament. American test pilots who had spent years being warned that Japanese fighters were fast but fragile now found themselves flying one that broke that rule entirely: fast, agile, and built to bring its pilot home. For a few months in late 1944, it seemed as though Japan had done what no one thought possible this late in the war. It had built a fighter that could genuinely contest air superiority against the best America could send against it, flown by pilots who no longer had to choose between protecting themselves and winning the fight. Production numbers began climbing. Word spread through Japanese fighter squadrons that a new aircraft had arrived that could finally even the odds. Nakajima's factories at Ota and Utsunomiya ramped toward full capacity, pushing to get as many Hayates into frontline hands as the assembly lines could turn out. It was briefly exactly the aircraft Japan needed. The tragedy was in the timing and in what was happening 3,000 miles away, at the very factories building it, a story that would only become clear in the months that followed, as the same country that had finally built its finest fighter began running out of everything required to keep it flying. The performance the Hayate showed in its best moments over Leyte and the Philippines was not what most pilots experienced by early 1945, and the gap between the two told its own story about the state of Japan's war machine. In the hands of a veteran pilot with a well-tuned engine under him, the Hayate remained everything Koyama had promised: fast, tough, and forgiving of mistakes that would have killed a Zero pilot instantly. But those conditions were becoming harder to find. American submarines had been strangling Japan's supply lines for over a year, and by the start of 1945, the shortage had reached something as basic as aviation fuel octane. Engines designed to run on high-grade gasoline were increasingly fed lower-quality substitutes, and the He-45 Homare, the very engine that had made the Hayate's balance of speed and armor possible in the first place, was not forgiving of the difference. Pilots who pushed their throttles to the settings that had won fights over Leyte now risked an engine that simply quit on them. Statistics gathered by American intelligence units evaluating captured aircraft and interrogating former Japanese maintenance crews after the war painted a picture that Japanese command understood only in fragments at the time. The Hayate that rolled off the assembly line in early 1945 was, mechanically, a different aircraft than the one that had first proven itself the previous autumn. Squadrons that had once reported the Hayate as a decisive equalizer against American fighters now logged a rising share of aircraft lost not to enemy fire, but to engine failure, landing accidents, and mechanical breakdowns before they ever reached combat. The airframe that Koyama's team had engineered to survive gunfire was, increasingly, being undone by problems no design change could fix, problems rooted not in the blueprint, but in the factories building it and the fuel feeding it. Even so, in the hands of the pilots who could still coax full performance from a good engine, the Hayate remained dangerous through the first months of 1945, and it earned a new role that its designers had never originally intended: defending the Japanese home islands against the B-29 superfortress. The Hayate's heavy cannon armament, built to shred American fighters, proved just as effective against the enormous high-flying bombers now reducing Japanese cities to ash. Interceptor squadrons flying the Hayate racked up confirmed kills against B-29 formations through the spring of 1945, using the aircraft's climb rate to reach the bomber's altitude and its firepower to bring them down in a single pass, a small, fierce success story playing out even as everything around it began to collapse. That success masked a truth that was becoming impossible to ignore inside Nakajima's own factories. The aircraft was no longer the problem. Japan was running out of the fuel to fly it, the skilled workers to build it, and, most quietly and most permanently, the trained pilots to fly it the way it had been designed to be flown. The rising generation of replacement pilots rushed through abbreviated training programs as Japan's flight schools fed the losses of 4 years of war, were handed one of the most capable fighters Japan had ever built, and given only a fraction of the hours needed to master it. A machine engineered to reward skill and aggressive flying was, increasingly, being flown by men who had neither. The same design that had solved the Zero's fatal weakness was now standing on a factory floor that could no longer support it, and a fuel supply that could no longer feed it properly. The aircraft had not failed. Everything around the aircraft had. The bombing campaign that the Hayate fought so hard to resist was not aimed only at Japanese cities. It was aimed with brutal precision at the very factory that made the aircraft possible in the first place. On November 24, 1944, the first major B-29 raid against Tokyo did not target the city itself. It targeted the Nakajima aircraft engine plant at Musashino, on the western outskirts of the capital, the single facility most responsible for producing the He-45 Homare engines that powered every Hayate in the sky. American planners had studied Japan's industrial map carefully enough to know exactly where the bottleneck sat, and they struck it directly, again and again, through the following months. Each raid chipped away at the plant's capacity, forcing skilled machinists to work amid rubble and forcing Nakajima to disperse engine production to smaller, hastily converted facilities that lacked the precision tooling the Homare's tight tolerances demanded. The same engine that had made Koyama's balance of armor and speed possible was now being built, in growing numbers, by workers without the equipment or the training to build it correctly. The political response to this crisis made the technical problem worse rather than better. Imperial General Headquarters, facing mounting losses on every front, responded to the industrial collapse not by consolidating and protecting what capacity remained, but by demanding higher production numbers from a shrinking, increasingly damaged base. Factory managers, caught between impossible quotas from above and vanishing resources on the ground, made a decision that would echo through every Hayate built in the war's final year. They let quality control standards slide in order to hit raw output targets. Engines that would have failed inspection in 1943 were passed and installed in 1945. Airframes went out with rushed riveting and thinner tolerances than Koyama's original design called for. The aircraft rolling off the line still looked like a Hayate. Mechanically, many of them were a compromised version of the machine that had performed so well over Leyte only months earlier. The labor filling the gap left by conscripted and killed factory workers told its own story about how desperate the effort had become. Students, some barely into their teens, were pulled from classrooms into aircraft factories under wartime mobilization orders, given a fraction of the training a peacetime aircraft worker would have received, and set to assembling components for one of the most sophisticated fighters Japan had ever built. The precision that Koyama's design demanded. Sealed fuel tanks that had to actually seal, armor mounts that had to actually hold under stress, an engine that had to be built to exacting standard to survive the power it was rated for, was being entrusted more and more to hands that had never built an aircraft before the war forced them to. Even the pilots meant to fly what these factories produced were being pulled away in growing numbers toward a different mission entirely. As 1945 wore on, Imperial Army Command increasingly diverted trained fighter pilots, men who understood how to extract the Hayate's full performance in a dogfight, toward kamikaze operations against the American fleet approaching Japan's shores. Every experienced pilot reassigned to a one-way mission was a pilot no longer available to fly interceptor patrols against B-29 formations and no longer available to train the inexperienced replacements filling squadron rosters behind him. The aircraft built to reward a skilled aggressive pilot was, in growing numbers, being handed to whoever remained. And the enemy the Hayate had been built to match was no longer standing still. By March of 1945, American forces had captured Iwo Jima, and P-51 Mustangs began flying escort missions alongside the B-29 formations all the way to the Japanese home islands and back, a round trip of well over 1,000 miles that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. The Hayate that had matched the Mustang on equal terms in 1944, flown by a trained pilot in a properly built aircraft, now increasingly met American fighters while flown by exhausted, undertrained replacements, riding engines built under wartime shortcuts, taking off from airfields that were themselves under constant attack. The margin that had made the Hayate genuinely competitive in the autumn of 1944 was being erased from every direction at once, not because the design had failed, but because everything the design depended on to function as intended was being dismantled around it, piece by piece, raid by raid, quota by impossible quota. By the summer of 1945, the aircraft that intelligence officers on both sides agreed was, on paper, The finest fighter Japan had ever built was flying in numbers that looked impressive on a production chart and meant almost nothing in the sky. The philosophy that Koyama had built the Hayate around, protect the pilot, trust the engine, let the aircraft absorb what the Zero never could, was still sound. It was the country building and flying it that no longer had the fuel, the factories, the trained hands, or the trained pilots left to prove it. The 19th of January, 1945. Snow was falling over the Kanto Plain as another formation of B-29s crossed the coast, climbing toward 30,000 feet, engines droning in a sound that residents of western Tokyo had learned to dread. Their target, for the fifth time in 2 months, was the Nakajima engine plant at Musashino. By this point in the campaign, American planners no longer needed reconnaissance photographs to find it. They had the coordinates memorized. Inside the plant, workers who had rebuilt damaged tooling after the previous raid, and the raid before that, took shelter as the first bombs began to fall, knowing that whatever machinery survived this pass would need rebuilding again before the next one arrived. This was not a single catastrophic strike that ended Hayate production in an afternoon. It was worse than that, a slow, deliberate strangulation, raid after raid through the winter and spring of 1945, each one arriving before the damage from the last had been repaired. By the time American forces secured Iwo Jima in March and began flying long-range fighter escorts alongside the bombers, the raids on Musashino had become almost routine, a fixture of the war's final months rather than a single decisive blow. And it worked precisely because it never let up. Every week the plant spent rebuilding jigs and retooling assembly lines was a week it was not building the precision engines the Hayate needed to fly the way Koyama had designed it to fly. By the summer of 1945, the aircraft that had matched the Hellcat and outclimbed the Mustang the previous autumn was being flown in growing numbers by interceptor squadrons that could no longer count on a properly built engine beneath the cowling, adequate fuel in the tank, or enough hours of training behind the man in the cockpit. The gap between what the Hayate was capable of on a test range in 1943 and what it could deliver in the sky over Japan in 1945 had become the story of the aircraft itself. Not a story of a flawed design, but of a sound design flying inside a country that no longer had the industrial base to support it. Nakajima's own leadership watched this unfold from the inside, unable to reverse it. The company that had produced 3,514 Hayates between April of 1944 and the war's final weeks, built at Ota, at Utsunomiya, and at a satellite plant run by the Manchu Aeroplane Manufacturing Company in occupied Manchuria, was, by the summer of 1945, an organization running on momentum rather than capacity. Raw materials arrived late or not at all. Skilled machinists who had spent decades perfecting the tolerances the Homare engine demanded had been conscripted, killed in earlier raids, or simply exhausted past the point of precision work. The company kept assembling aircraft because stopping was unthinkable, not because it still had what it needed to build them properly. The personal toll fell hardest on the men who had to fly what the factories were now producing. Interceptor pilots defending the home islands through the summer of 1945 were, increasingly, flying missions in aircraft they had reason to distrust. Engines that might seize at full throttle, airframes assembled under wartime shortcuts, fuel that had been cut with lower-grade substitutes that fouled the very engine the Hayate depended on. For a pilot climbing to meet a B-29 formation at 30,000 feet, every mission now carried a second danger beyond the enemy guns. The possibility that the machine itself, built to protect him, might fail before he ever reached the fight. By August of 1945, with atomic bombs having fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet Union entering the war in Manchuria, the industrial and military structure that had sustained the Hayate program for 14 months finally gave way entirely. Production at Ota and Utsunomiya, already reduced to a fraction of its earlier pace, ground to a halt in the war's final days. On the 15th of August, when Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast reached the men still flying interceptor patrols in Hayates over the home islands, some pilots reportedly refused to believe the war had actually ended, flying one final patrol before returning to airfields that had nothing left to defend. Within weeks, the aircraft that had been Japan's answer to the Hellcat, the Mustang, and the Thunderbolt, the finest fighter the country had ever built, was formally retired, its brief operational life closing at barely 14 months from the day it first reached frontline squadrons. What remained afterward was not a single dramatic collapse, but the quiet accumulation of everything. The bombing campaign, the fuel shortage, and the training crisis had already done to the aircraft and the men who flew it, long before the surrender made it official. The engineer who had solved the Zero's fatal flaw had built, by every technical measure, a winning aircraft. He had simply built it inside a country that ran out of everything except the aircraft itself. World War II's final weeks left almost nothing standing at Nakajima that resembled the company that had built the Hayate. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the men who had designed and built one of the finest fighters of the entire war did not return to their drafting tables. They returned to nothing. The occupying Allied authorities, determined that Japan would never again build an air force capable of threatening its neighbors, moved swiftly to dismantle the entire industry that had produced it. Within months, General Headquarters banned Japanese companies from designing, building, or even researching aircraft of any kind, a prohibition that would remain in force for years. Yasushi Koyama and the engineers who had spent 1942 and 1943 solving the Zero's fatal flaws now found themselves barred by law from ever touching an airframe again. The skill that had let them out-engineer the Hellcat had overnight become a skill with nowhere legal to go. Nakajima Aircraft Company itself did not survive the occupation as a single entity. GHQ ordered it broken apart entirely, split into 12 separate, unconnected companies, stripped of the name and the unified structure that had built the Hayate, the Ki-84, and years of aircraft before them. Some of those fragments found new lives far from aviation. Two of the largest eventually became Fuji Heavy Industries, the company known today as Subaru, and Fuji Precision Industries, which went on to build Prince Motors automobiles. The precision manufacturing skill that had once machined tolerances tight enough for a 2,000 horsepower radial engine was redirected piece by piece into building cars for a defeated country trying to rebuild something, anything, that the occupation would allow it to make. For the pilots who had flown the Hayate through its final desperate months of home island defense, the war's end brought a different kind of reckoning. Many of the men still flying interceptor patrols in the summer of 1945 were painfully young, rushed through abbreviated training programs that gave them a fraction of the hours a Hayate pilot needed to survive, let alone win, against the Mustangs and Hellcats now escorting American bombers over Japan itself. A significant number of the Imperial Army's most experienced Hayate pilots, the men who understood exactly how to exploit the aircraft's climb rate and turning radius, the men who had proven over Leyte that it could beat anything America put in the sky, had already been pulled away from interceptor duty entirely, reassigned in the war's final year to kamikaze operations against the American fleet, missions from which there was no return flight to debrief, no lessons carried forward, no chance to pass on what they knew to the replacements filling squadron rosters behind them. The aircraft that had been built specifically to bring its pilot home was, in its final year, increasingly flown by men sent up with no expectation of coming home at all. The workforce that had built the Hayate through its final desperate production push told its own story of a country running on fumes. Teenage students, conscripted into wartime labor mobilization as Japan's adult workforce was consumed by the front and by the bombing campaign, had spent the war's last year assembling components for one of the most technically demanding aircraft Japan had ever fielded, learning riveting and wiring on the job with a fraction of the training a peacetime aircraft worker would have received. When the surrender came, those students went home to a country with its cities burned, its currency worthless, and its aircraft industry outlawed by occupation decree. The skills they had rushed to learn under bombardment had no legal use left to serve. What remained, when the smoke cleared and the occupation authorities finished their audit of Japan's wartime industry, was a strange and uncomfortable verdict that even the men who had built the Hayate would have recognized as true. The aircraft itself had never been the failure. American test pilots who flew captured examples after the surrender confirmed exactly what Japanese pilots had already learned in the cockpit, that the Hayate, properly built and properly flown, could outturn a Mustang and outclimb a Hellcat, that Koyama's gamble on armor and horsepower together had paid off exactly as he intended. The failure belonged to everything surrounding the aircraft. The factories that could no longer build it to specification, the fuel that could no longer feed its engine properly, the pilots who never got the hours to master it, and a government that had run out of every resource except the willingness to keep asking for more. Koyama had set out in 1942 to build a fighter that would not repeat the Zero's fatal mistake, a machine that protected the man flying it as fiercely as it protected the mission he flew. He had succeeded. The company that built his design would not survive the peace intact, banned from the industry it had helped create. The pilots who might have proven his aircraft's full potential were, in growing numbers, sent to die in machines that would never return by design, rather than in the one built to bring them home. And the workers who assembled his finest engineering achievement in its last most desperate months did so as children pulled from school, building an aircraft that arrived exactly 2 years too late to change anything at all. The story of Nakajima's corporate fate had already been told by the time occupation authorities finished dividing the company in the years after the surrender. 12 fragments scattered from a single aircraft manufacturer, 2 of which would eventually matter more to post-war Japan than any fighter the original company ever built. Fuji Heavy Industries, assembled from several of those Nakajima fragments, spent the following decades building automobiles under a name the world would come to know as Subaru. Another fragment became Fuji Precision Industries, which built the Prince Motor Company's cars before merging into Nissan in the 1960s. The engineers who had once machined tolerances precise enough to keep a 2,000 horsepower radial engine from tearing itself apart under supercharger boost spent the rest of their careers machining engine blocks for family sedans. It was not the aviation legacy Koyama had built the Hayate to leave behind, but it was, in its own way, a form of survival. Japanese precision manufacturing, finding a new outlet after the old one had been outlawed entirely. Only one complete Hayate survived long enough to tell its own story past 1945, and its journey after the war reads almost like an argument for the aircraft's quality, carried out entirely by the country it had been built to fight. Captured at Clark Field in the Philippines in 1945, the aircraft, serial number 146, was shipped back to the United States aboard the escort carrier USS Long Island for evaluation, one of a handful of Hayate's American intelligence wanted intact enough to fly and measure against its own frontline fighters. In 1952, it was sold as surplus to Edward Maloney, a California collector building what would eventually become the Planes of Fame Air Museum. 11 years later, in 1963, Maloney's team achieved something no one had attempted with a Japanese wartime fighter before. They restored the Hayate to full flying condition at iResearch's facility at Los Angeles International Airport, registering it under American Civil Aviation as N3385G. At the controls for its test flights was Walker Bud Mahurin, a genuine American ace who had fought in both the Second World War and Korea, an American combat pilot flying the aircraft. Japanese pilots had once flown against his own countrymen, 18 years after the war that built it had ended. The aircraft flew in American hands for a decade before making the journey back across the Pacific it had once patrolled. In 1973, the restored Hayate was returned to Japan, put on display at the Arashiyama Museum in Kyoto. What followed there was less a triumphant homecoming than a slow, undignified decline. Unsupervised public access to the aircraft led to parts being stolen piece by piece over the following years, and combined with the wear of age, the Hayate that had once flown again over Los Angeles could no longer fly at all. When the Arashiyama Museum closed its doors in 1991, the aircraft was transferred to its current home, the Chirin Peace Museum in Kagoshima Prefecture, where it has remained ever since. Its exterior eventually restored, and the airframe finally moved indoors, out of the weather that had aged it for decades. It stands today as the only complete Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate left anywhere in the world, a single surviving example of an aircraft that once numbered 3,514, preserved not because Japan managed to protect it, but in large part because an American collector, an American mechanic, and an American ace decided, less than 2 decades after the war, that it was worth saving. The historical verdict on the Hayate, when military historians and aviation engineers on both sides of the Pacific finally had the distance to render one, has remained strikingly consistent for decades. The design itself was never the problem. Post-war flight testing by American evaluators, conducted on properly fueled and properly maintained examples, confirmed exactly what the aircraft's best combat performances over Leyte had already suggested, that a well-built Hayate flown by a trained pilot could outturn a Hellcat, outclimb a Mustang, and survive gunfire that would have ended a Zero's flight and its pilot's life in the same instant. Koyama had done precisely what he set out to do in 1942. Built a Japanese fighter that protected the man flying it without giving up the speed and agility that had always been the source of Japanese fighter doctrine's confidence. The verdict on his engineering was, and remains, unambiguous. The verdict on Japan's ability to actually deliver that aircraft to war, at scale, with the fuel and the trained hands and the trained pilots it needed, was a separate and much harsher story. One written not in the blueprints at Nakajima's drafting tables, but in the bombed-out ruins of the Musashino engine plant, in fuel tanks filled with substitute gasoline that fouled a precision engine never designed to run on it, and in cockpits filled with 18-year-olds who had barely finished flight school before being sent up to defend a country that no longer had the industrial base to support the very machine it was counting on to save it. The aircraft had been engineered to win. The country building it had run out of everything except the aircraft itself, and by the time it reached the sky in the numbers Japan needed, there was nothing left standing behind it to make that victory possible. The Zero had been a masterpiece of subtraction. Strip away the armor, strip away the self-sealing tanks, strip away every pound that didn't serve speed or agility, and trust that a pilot skilled enough would never need to absorb a hit in the first place. It was a philosophy built for a war Japan expected to win quickly, with pilots who had years to train and enemies who had not yet learned to fight back. The Hayate was a masterpiece of addition. Add the armor plate the Zero never carried. Add the self-sealing tanks that gave a hit pilot a second chance instead of a fireball. Add enough horsepower underneath it all to carry that extra weight into a dogfight and still come out ahead. It was a philosophy built by an engineer who had read the casualty reports from the first philosophy and refused to accept that speed had to cost a man his life. Both philosophies were, in their own way, correct. The Zero had ruled the skies when Japan's enemies were unprepared and its pilots were the most experienced in the Pacific. The Hayate ruled the skies whenever a trained pilot climbed into a properly built example with a full tank of real aviation fuel, matching the Hellcat maneuver for maneuver, outclimbing the Mustang, bringing its pilot home from fights that would have killed him in anything Japan had built before it. Subtraction won when Japan had the advantage of surprise and experience. Addition won when Japan needed its pilots to survive long enough to keep fighting. Neither philosophy was ever really tested against the thing that actually decided the war's final year. Not the aircraft in the sky, but the factories on the ground, the fuel in the tanks, and the hours of training a pilot had before he ever reached the cockpit. That is the quiet, uncomfortable truth sitting underneath every account of Japan's finest wartime fighter. Engineering can solve a design flaw. It cannot rebuild a bombed engine plant overnight, and it cannot manufacture experienced pilots faster than a war can kill them. Koyama solved the problem he was handed in 1942, completely, decisively, and 2 years later than the war could afford to wait for him. Everyone remembers the Zero. It arrived at the right moment, in the hands of pilots who had the time to master it, against enemies who had not yet learned to beat it, and its legend was written before its flaws ever caught up with it in the record books. Almost no one remembers the aircraft that actually fixed what killed those Zero pilots, because by the time it reached the sky in real numbers, there was no clean moment left for it to prove itself in, no easy legend left to write. It fought its best battles in the margins of a collapsing war, over Leyte and over the ruins of Tokyo, matching aircraft that history remembers as legends while flying with engines built by exhausted teenagers and fuel that was never meant to power it. A single Hayate survives today, sitting in a museum in Kagoshima, restored once by American hands that thought it was worth saving, worn down once by the neglect of the country that built it, and saved again only because someone, somewhere, refused to let the last one disappear. It is a strange kind of monument, proof that the engineering was never the failure, sitting quietly in a country that still remembers the aircraft that came before it far more fondly than the one that actually got the design right. Somewhere in that quiet museum hall is the answer to the question this story opened with. How does a country build its finest fighter of the entire war and still lose the sky? It builds it 2 years too late, and hands it to a nation that no longer has anything left to give it.